Welcome to you, Jack. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Hey, it's great to be here, Jill. Thanks for having me.
Well, we had a chance to connect just a few days ago to sort of talk about how we might get started with our conversation today. Just for the audience, I will let you know that we will welcome your questions throughout, and there will definitely be time to come to your questions at the end. But I will get started with a few questions of my own. Um, Jack, I would like to just pause and sort of acknowledge that Clio is one of our most successful anchor companies in BC. We were thrilled when you were named Anchor Company of the Year just a few years ago. And of course, you yourself have now been inducted into the BC Innovators Hall of Fame as a real leader and mentor for our community. So, congratulations and thank you for being part of this ecosystem and celebrating those achievements.
Yeah, and likewise, thanks for the recognition over the years to you and BC Tech, Jill. It's been a real honor to be recognized over the course of the last 15 years as we've grown the company in BC.
That's what we'd like to do if we can. There's nothing that makes me happier than to see Startup of the Year become Growth Company of the Year, become Scale Company of the Year, become Anchor Company of the Year, and be part of them along that whole journey. So now let's step back and narrow in on the Clio journey and think back to those early days and what was unique about the way you started.
Well, there's a few things that were unique about the Clio story. One is I, excuse me, founded the company with my childhood best friend Ryan Govro, who I met in grade 3 when we were 8 years old in Edmonton at Terrace Elementary School. And Ryan and I became good friends over the course of the ensuing years, and we're best pals all the way through elementary and then junior high school. And at when we decided to move on to post-secondary, Ryan moved out to Vancouver and pursued a kinesiology degree at SFU and then an MBA at UBC. And I went to the University of Alberta, where I did a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree in computer science. And while I was working at a U of A spinoff company, I caught the startup bug, really fell in love with the idea of building a startup. I went through the experience of raising money. This company was called Economics. I got the chance to go down to the Valley and just feel the energy down in Silicon Valley and talk to Valley-based investors. And over those 5 years at Economics, I really built out a passion for the startup life and decided I eventually wanted to start my own company and go kind of run the whole thing. And this was back in 2007. And, just to kind of set the stage, this was the year the iPhone was first released. So the 2007 was a sea of Blackberries, a lot of on-premise software. Companies like Salesforce.com were just starting to emerge and see some success. But the idea of the cloud was very nascent at this point. But as a technologist, I recognized what a transformative wave the cloud represented, and that this is one of these once in a lifetime waves of technology that comes along, that if you catch that wave and ride it, you can really accomplish amazing things. And so at that point, I reached out to Ryan and said, "Hey, you're midway through your MBA. I've got my master's in computer science under my belt. I've fallen in love with this idea of building something with cloud as the underlying technology. What kind of industry do you think we should go and disrupt?" So at that point, I really described me and Ryan as two hammers looking for a nail, in the sense we kind of knew what the solution was. We knew we were going to build something on the cloud, but we didn't know exactly what industry we were going to go after. At that time, Ryan happened to be working at Gowlings as their IT manager. And for those of you that don't know, Gowlings is one of Canada's largest law firms. And Ryan had a first row seat to how law firms use technology and how in some cases law firms don't use technology to really to the maximum effect. And he said, look, I think legal could be a really interesting space for us to go after. We started doing some market research. We engaged with the Law Society of British Columbia, which is the regulator of lawyers, and had a lot of great conversations with them about how they saw the needs in the legal space. One of the very interesting conversations that led to Clio's eventual founding was with the director of practice standards there, that his job was basically to discipline lawyers that have mishandled client funds, for example, or missed a key limitation date, received a client complaint. And basically, if lawyers receive any kind of a complaint, his job was to discover what went wrong and then to figure out how to remediate the behavior with the lawyer. And his comment to us was, look, the big firm lawyers, the folks at, the Gowlings of the world, they've got a huge support system helping make sure that if they drop a ball, somebody else catches it before it hits the floor and shatters. Solo small firm lawyers, on the other hand, they don't. It's really just them, maybe a very thin layer of admin and support staff. But if they drop a ball, all too often it does hit the floor and shatter. So that's the segment that could really benefit from something like what we were considering building, which was cloud-based legal practice management. And then we did the market research, and we discovered that this is actually an enormous space, that 80% of all lawyers practice in firms of 10 lawyers or less, and 50% of all lawyers practice as solos. So, and this was surprising to me and Ryan, for that matter, who were, outsiders to the legal industry. Our education on legal really consisted of reading John Grisham novels and watching Ally McBeal and others on network TV, and thought all lawyers worked in these big, high-powered firms. But it turns out that's actually a fairly small minority of lawyers, and the rest of the legal market is very entrepreneurial and very SMB. So that was the light bulb moment. That was, okay, let's go build a cloud-based legal practice management system that does everything from invoice to intake, and deliver that to the legal market. And we got to work building it ourselves, and launched the product in 2008. And
Well, I'm gonna just interrupt you
yeah,
there, because this
jump
is
in.
the other interesting. So you've got your degree, Ryan's got his degree, you've got this idea of cloud's going to change the world, you've got your problem statement, you know how you're going to launch Clio, and then along comes the global financial crash.
Right.
That's also happening in 2008.
Right.
How did that change your plans or influence the start of Clio? Navigating that must have been crazy as well.
Yeah, well, just to set that stage, so we got to work on building the product, launched the product in March of 2008. That's when we launched our beta, and we officially launched the product in October of 2008. And between those two, kind of the launch of the beta and the launch of the product, we started the fundraising process. And I remember the cover of The Economist at that time was a picture of a whirlpool of darkness, with all the big bank logos like JP Morgan and Bear Stearns and all the others that were collapsing at that time, swirling down the drain. And the title of the cover was "When Will It End?" And it was just this very dark time where we were pitching every angel investor we could find in BC and Alberta. We can talk about this more later, but by the way, for the first year or two, Ryan was based in Vancouver, I was based in Edmonton, and so we were working in a completely distributed way, with both some of our early employees being both in BC and Alberta, and me and Ryan traveling back and forth to connect in person a whole bunch. So we were doing the distributed thing before it was cool, as we saw in the years following COVID. But back to your question, we were raising money in this really difficult time with investors. What some of the hardest feedback to hear from investors, which was basically, we love the idea, we love what you guys are doing, we're just not writing checks right now. We're just really kind of terrified that, and this is hard to imagine, but the legit fear at that time was the financial system as we knew it was going to collapse. And anyone who's watched the Big Short, it's a great story of exactly what this time looked like. But people were really terrified about what the future looked like, and would just not invest at all. So we ended up getting, if you can believe it, a cold inbound email from an investor in Germany, a guy named Christoph Jans, that emailed us in late 2008 and said, I read about Clio on a blog called web2.0central.com. And this was a blog that my friend Reg Charami ran. And he asked me one day if he could write a review about Clio. And I thought, like, sure, no one's going to read it, but at least it'll be some inbound links and some Google juice, as we talked about in those days. So why not? And he interviewed me for this blog post. This Christoph Jans guy reads this blog post and is interested in Clio, sends us this cold inbound email and says, I recently sold my I'm investor based in Germany. I recently sold my company to it was some of the MySpace affiliated companies that acquired his company. I've now become an angel investor, and I just closed my first angel investment in a company called Zendesk, which he invested in when it was just 4 guys in a bar in Copenhagen, by the way. And then he came to us as his next potential investment. And what's hilarious is this email went straight to our spam box. It I think was from a web.de email address and was talking about investment. So it probably threw all the spam email flags off on Google's spam detection system. So we inadvertently slow played Christoph, and that email sat in our inbox for 2 weeks. He said a follow up. And in what I can only describe as an act of God, Ryan was on a long, boring customer support call and wondered during this call, I wonder what's in my spam folder, and looks in his spam folder, which you hardly ever wonder what's in your spam folder. Ryan did that day in what turned out to be a great act of fate for us as a company, and saw this email from Christoph, forwarded it to me, and said, "This looks legit. What do you think?" And I followed up with Christoph, and cut to a quick day trip to Berlin and back for me and Ryan, and some due diligence with Christoph. He wrote the first $1 million check into Clio, and the rest was history. So the takeaway, the first takeaway maybe of our conversation, Jill, can be check your spam folder. You never know what's in there. But that was the save from a very difficult fundraising environment in 2008.
That's amazing. I love that story. Yeah, I'm checking my spam folder immediately after this call. But it was still a challenging time. I remember right the way through 2008, 2009 into 2010. So you've got your $1 million, you've got your seed funding, you're able to get the company off the ground. What was it like to try and sell people on a very different software approach in the midst of a financial crisis? Did you find that customers were hesitant to buy, or did they immediately see the opportunity?
Well, there was a lot to like about the business model of software as a service in a downturn and in a tight economic environment where you're not needing to make any large capital expenses. You don't need to buy hardware. You don't need to spend a bunch of money implementing it with consultants and so on. And even the software cost is a subscription as opposed to an upfront cost. So if money is tight, a software as a service model is actually a great model in a downturn, and I think it's something that has consistently served as a bit of a tailwind for us when things get tight. We saw it in 2008, 2009. We've actually seen a huge tailwind over the course of the last year in our business as law firms are trying to find ways to run their IT more efficiently. And again, a lot of businesses prefer an OpEx over a CapEx if they can make the choice. The biggest challenge we had in 2008 that I am happy to report that 15 years later, I think we've finally convinced the space that this is the right way to go. But it was more about the idea of putting your data in the cloud. That was the big friction point for lawyers. And this stemmed from a very reasonable set of ethical considerations lawyers have. They have a bunch of fiduciary obligations to their clients that many other professionals do as well, but this is especially the case with lawyers, where they feel and rightfully feel an obligation to ensure that their client data will be safe and secure. And the fairly radical statement we made in 2008 that I think has borne out to be true, but it was certainly radical sounding in 2008, was your data is actually more secure in a cloud-based environment than it is in an on-premise environment, especially if you're a solo or small firm. you're not investing significant resources in your security. You're not getting an external firm to penetration test your network. You might not even be able to stay on top of all the Windows updates and security patches that we had to do in the old days. And your server might be, in a broom closet in your office that, the cleaning staff and anyone else that comes in and out of your space might have ready access to. So the biggest question we faced was, is the cloud going to be secure? And can we convince the legal community that the cloud is not only as secure as on-premise, but actually more secure? And as soon as we realized that was basically the existential threat to Clio, is if we can't get the conversation moved away from what was a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, that, by the way, was being stemmed by or prompted by a lot of the on-premise vendors that saw us as a threat. They were planting the seeds of all of this fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We saw the opportunity as really being, how do we lead the conversation in this space rather than getting dragged along with it? Is there a way that we can really be thought leaders in this space? And that's exactly what we became. We started publishing white papers on the security and ethics of cloud computing for lawyers. We started working directly with the bar associations and law societies to come out with ethics opinions on cloud computing being acceptable for lawyers. I got on a plane and spoke at every legal conference I could get an invite to for, the first, 10 years of Clio's existence, pretty much. And like I said, I'm happy to report that it took a while, but I think it was actually finally COVID that tipped the laggards into realizing that the cloud is not a convenience anymore. It's not something that just leading edge firms are adopting, but law firms started realizing that any kind of on-premise technology, any kind of on-premise information, even if it's client files sitting in a filing cabinet, is a liability. Because if something like COVID happens or a natural disaster happens and you can't access those physical files or on-premise software, you're all of a sudden completely unable to service your clients. And the cloud has finally, I think, entered the mainstream in legal. And like I said, we're seeing a bit of a tailwind of growth thanks to that, thanks to COVID and the ensuing adoption of cloud over the course of the last 3 years.
That's excellent. I mean, the Clio story is a great story, and you are an excellent storyteller. So it's fabulous to come along this journey and learn your story. But I can hear so much resonance for some of our startups who will be on the call today around, don't be intimidated by economic downturns. There is still smart capital out there, and customers are really motivated to look for cost saving opportunities, which your solution might allow. And also this idea of change the conversation and be a thought leader and identify the existential threat to your startup and tackle it head on. I think that's great advice for startups in all sorts of verticals, not just your own. So thank you for
Yeah,
sharing.
and there could be a tendency to try to ignore some of those threats as well. And I think that's what we realized was, look, our initial thought was we can just stand on our own, and the benefits of the cloud will eventually become obvious to everyone. But you do really need to be your own strongest advocate. And when you see something like that level of existential threat to your business, I think it's better to run at it and take it on firsthand. And by the way, we're seeing, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I see a lot of parallels with AI and the discourse around AI today, as we did with the cloud in 2008, 2009. And I think AI represents the same kind of opportunity, by the way, in terms of, not just a once in a 10-year, but a once in a probably generation or multi-generation opportunity for companies, both existing and new companies, to embrace AI and build exciting new products with AI.
I agree. It's going to be a roller coaster, but lots of opportunities as well as concerns, and as you said, fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Yes.
Now, thinking about as Clio starts to scale, one of the things we were talking about was the critical importance of talent, the right kind of talent to grow a business, but we don't always get it right. Could you tell us about about some of your early mistakes and where they came from and how you overcame them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's hiring people and getting the right people into the right roles in your company is the most important thing to get right in your company, but it's also probably the easiest thing to get wrong. When you really feel the pain of not having a key position filled, you start becoming willing to settle, and the bar is not always as high as you might want to be, or you might not even know exactly what you need for the role, and kind of uh, put too much value in the wrong things when you're recruiting for that role. So a couple of the mistakes I made over the years, one would be hiring executives from companies that either I've gotten kind of swayed by the logos of the companies they've worked for. So somebody worked for a Salesforce or a Google, and therefore they must be amazing, or maybe somebody that has come from Shopify as another example. And there's a few really tricky things to watch out for there. One is when you look at these hugely successful companies like Salesforce or Google or Shopify, it can become very hard to discern who actually drove that success versus who was a passenger along for the ride, and really discerning what somebody contributed directly into that growth story, and really trying to unpack what their direct contributions were needs to be a really deep part of your conversations in the interview process, as well as something you need to really prove out in doing back channel referencing on the person. So we can talk a little bit more about that later. But the second mistake is just falling in love with the logo and the scale of the company they're working for. And what was really surprising to me, and I learned the hard way, is sometimes you can recruit an executive that's done a phenomenal job at these companies and was actually driving a lot of the success, but the stage they're at is a significant leap beyond where you are as a startup, and the skill set you need, and the roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirtiness that is required in a startup may be completely foreign to one of these seasoned executives at a big successful tech company. So if you're trying to figure out how do I get from 1 million to 5 million of revenue, or 10 million to 20 million of revenue, I can almost guarantee you that somebody that helped Facebook get from 500 million of revenue to a billion of revenue is not going to have a translatable skill set. And they're also going to assume that there's a lot more in place to support them in their role that, again, no startup has in place. Like they're going to ask, who's my RevOps person? And you're going to say, who's helping me implement the Salesforce workflows? Well, that's you also. Like you really need somebody that has been through that specific stage of the journey. So I made several mistakes along the years hiring, great people and people that were phenomenal contributors in different ways at the companies they came from, but that were just really a poor fit for this stage of company we were at. And this isn't an absolute rule for me, but one of the overall frameworks I try to use in recruiting executive talent now is how can we bring somebody on board that helps us get from where has seen the story and has seen the movie before of the specific stage of growth we're going through. So, in our case, if we're hiring an executive, if we're hiring a VP sales, for example, for Clio, I'd be looking for somebody who's taken a SaaS business. It doesn't need to be a vertical SaaS business, but a SaaS business from 200 million of ARR to $500 million of ARR, for example. And it could be partially overlapping with that journey. It could be, a superset of that journey, and they've gone from 100 million to a billion. But I'm looking for some overlap where they can bring and adapt a playbook that they've seen at another company that is customized for our specific needs.
Perfect. So you can see that potential match and overlap between your needs and their background and where they were. What do you then do in the interview? Do you have a killer question or approach to questions that helps you discern what they've really done?
Yeah, I I don't put a ton of weight in the interview itself. I really put a lot of weight into doing external back channel references on folks, because especially at the executive level, you've got people who are going to interview really well. You know, they don't catastrophically fail an interview, and they're great storytellers, right? And the stories could be entirely true or partially true. So I find, you know, at that level, I'm assessing more personality and culture fit and culture add. Do I feel like this is a person I can get along with? Are they a good communicator? Are they a clear communicator? Is there values alignment in the things I talk about with them? And then to try to do as best I can in discerning whether this person actually drove the things they're talking about driving, I really go deep. Like I'll go very deep in the details of what they drove, how they drove it, who they collaborated with to do that in the rest of the organization. Who else gets credit, by the way? So if they're talking about, you know, them doing something entirely on their own versus it being a team effort, it's an important signal. How often are they talking about I versus we? Is another important signal around how they think about teamwork and if they're accomplishing something as a team or not. But with that kind of initial interview done, I'll then do a panel interview with the rest of the executive team and a project, which is really an important part of our interview process at Clio. So we will, for example, my most recent executive hire was our chief product officer, a guy named Hemant Kashyap. And, you know, we gave him a bunch of data as a project and said, here's some data we got. We got Bain to do some market research for us, gave him a subset of that data and said, you know, tell us what story this data tells you about a product opportunity for Clio, or a segment of the customer base you would pursue if you were developing a new product for Clio. And so that takes away all the, you know, all the influence you can have of somebody's past experience, and really gives you a very compartmentalized view of how do they assimilate data, how do they build a plan, how do they articulate the plan, can they build a deck talking about that plan. And it requires a lot of work of the candidate, and we do lose some candidates that say I'm not putting that amount of work into an interview process, but I find it provides the strongest signal we've got on who's the right hire. And you know, I've seen a number of people, folks that we thought were terrific, blow up on the project, which is, you know, always sad to see when you've kind of got your heart set on someone. But we've also seen, obviously, in a number of cases where somebody, you know, hits the cover off the ball in the project and does a phenomenal job on it, and it helps us really build conviction around them as the successful candidate. And then, like I said, the last part of the process that I do concurrently with the rest of the hiring process is just a lot of both direct and indirect referencing. So I'll talk to both the people that the candidate gives me, you know, but I always treat those as conversations that are going to be positive, and do a lot of back channel referencing as well. And I think that's something that, in my experience, more energy should be put into referencing. And I'm always surprised how few calls I get about former executives that you know, are moving on to new roles at Clio that I'm not getting a call from their new employer, and I'm just surprised that it's not a matter of course for everyone these days.
I think that's a great observation, and we do neglect it. We like to think that we can construct the killer recruitment approach, or that, and rather than just asking people that have really encountered this person. But I agree with you. I'm always shocked at how few requests I get for what do you think of this
Yeah,
person. We
yeah,
were just
it's just more signal, and you should, you know, I don't think you should base your hiring decision on the interview on its own or referencing on its own, but you should try to collect as many data points as you can, at least to be even eyes wide open in terms of what this person will be like to work with, and how you could best support them as a manager and so on.
absolutely. So thinking about, I know there's a couple of things that our local startups and scale ups actually struggle with sometimes, and it is sticker shock at the price that they need to pay for an executive of the caliber that they need, and then struggling to find that person in the local market, maybe in BC. So I'm sure you must have encountered that. What would you be your shared experience around Clio tackling those topics?
Yeah. So one, and I remember being an early founder, and again, raising $1 million, which isn't a huge amount of money, and then needing to go out and recruit some of my first key executive hires, and then seeing the resumes for a VP sales was one of the first hires we were making. And again, this is, 2009 dollars, but VP sales even then was like a $400,000 plus touch. And if you wanted somebody in the US, it was that in USD even. But so when you're cash constrained, that's really a significant amount of sticker shock. And what I've experienced over the years is anytime I've tried to kind of economize on those roles. Like maybe I don't need a VP of sales with experience, but maybe I can have like an up and coming director of sales from another company that might be able to do the job. You're The trade-off you're making is that the person is learning on the job, and you're essentially their training ground. And the trade-off there is number one, time. They're going to be slower in getting you to where you need to be in general, not as a rule. And you're going to be accumulating scar tissue along the way, in that they might be making some pretty significant mistakes in how they're doing things. And again, when you're a startup, you don't need many significant mistakes to accumulate to being basically a company-ending series of mistakes. I remember when we hired one of our first VP of sales, they were experienced and tenured, and it was amazing all the things we were struggling with, like how should we structure our sales team, how should we architect it, how should compensation work, what should the variable be based on, all these questions. They came in and they were just like, bam, 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 bam. And like the 15 decisions just got made in a day. And how do we recruit people? That was answered as well. And they knew how to build a team. And in the space of, a month, they got what would have taken us a year or more to figure out in terms of building out a high performance sales team. So all that is to say, I think when you're hiring great executive talent, you're going to pay a price for it, but it will be so accretive to your business that it's always going to be ROI positive when you look at the way they're going to inflect your revenue and the way they're going to inflect your valuation in kind. So it can be a tough pill to swallow, but I think, bringing the right talent on at what might be an eye-watering price is almost always the right decision, with a major caveat that it's got to be the right talent. So and you're not always going to get it right. We've all made mishires, and the trick there is just making sure you course correct as quickly as possible and exit them and bring somebody new into the business as quickly as you realize you've maybe made a mistake, and ensuring you're holding them accountable when you've got roles, especially a role like a VP of sales. You should be seeing those sales inflect and the revenue inflect inside of a quarter. And again, if you're hiring an experienced person, you can hold them to that bar. Whereas maybe if you've, hired that up and comer, you're making the tougher trade-off decision, which is, well, maybe they just need a little bit more time. Maybe I'll give them one more quarter to deliver the results. And again, it's just a few of those types of delays that can end up being, presenting a existential threat to a startup.
Absolutely. I mean, time to market is critical, right? You're competing with other startups or operating globally. If you're going slower,
Yeah.
that's going to be really important. And then did you look outside of BC for talent? And did you do that at an early stage, or was that only later in your journey?
Yeah, I think partly because we built the company in a distributed way from the get-go. And again, in 2008, in the first year of Clio's history, we had employees in Edmonton, in Calgary, in Vancouver, even up in Powell River, BC. So we had working in a distributed way baked into our DNA, basically. And so we were very open-minded about recruiting talent outside of Vancouver, outside of BC. And very quickly, in fact, our second VP of sales was based out of Toronto. And again, we very quickly started building a significant office in Toronto because we found it to be a much better hiring ground for certain types of talent than Vancouver. Vancouver, we were having phenomenal success with designers, product managers, engineers, and basically the product side of the house. When we talked about experienced sales executives and individual contributors on the sales side, we found Toronto was just a more plentiful market with more scaled SaaS companies. Even US-based companies like Salesforce opened their first international sales office in Toronto. So there was a bit more of a pedigree of sales folks to hire in Toronto. So I'm very much of the view, if you're building a scaled company in Canada, you can absolutely be headquartered in Vancouver and see a ton of success and employ a large percentage of your employee base in Vancouver and BC more broadly. And that's certainly the case with Clio. But to really, I think, scale and bring on that tenured talent, you need to be looking at probably Toronto as another hiring center. And eventually you need to be looking at the Bay Area as a hiring center as well. And today we've got about half of our senior team based in the US, and that senior team is VP and up, and about half of it is in Canada.
That's great. It's good to hear the concept of distributed by design and distributed from the beginning as a competitive advantage. And that's a
Yeah.
wonderful story. Listen, let's get a little bit personal about you rather than the team. So how would you say your leadership has changed or stayed the same or flexed as the company grew and scaled into something much larger than it was at the beginning?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I feel like my style has always been, number one, to be, very authentic to myself. And I think that's one of the recommendations I give to other CEOs when they ask, like, how do I be, CEO? And I think there's a lot of us that carry around some image of what it means to be a CEO. And a lot of folks are thinking, like, how do I act like Steve Jobs? Or how do I be more like Elon Musk? Although there's probably a little bit less of that these days than there was a couple of years ago. But at the end of the day, I think what employees connect to, and ultimately this is about building a team that wants to accomplish great things with you. People want to feel like they're connecting to somebody that is authentic and true to themselves. And so that's one thing I've really focused on being, and that's evolved and changed over the years. But I try to be real and approachable and pretty transparent about where I stand on things. What's been very interesting for me is the growth journey. The question I get sometimes is how have you worked the same job more or less for 15 years? That's incredible. And maybe the implied question behind the question is, like, aren't you bored? Like, this is the same thing for 15 years. And my response is always emphatically, it's not the same thing for 15 years. It's been an incredible journey where basically I have a new job every quarter. We've got, Clio's about 1,000 people today. We're about $200 million of annual recurring revenue. So the scale of the business is constantly growing and changing, and the demands of me and the team I get to work with is constantly evolving. And what engages me most is just being in an environment where I am learning. And I think to be in a high growth environment, no matter what your role is, you need to be a learning machine. If you're going to, one of the concepts we talk a lot about at Clio is, if the company is growing like this in an exponential way, and you're either not growing or even if you're growing in kind of a linear way, the company is going to outgrow you. And that can be a very dangerous place to be, where you're either your job is at risk or you're going to need to make some substantial change in what your job encompasses if you're not keeping up with the increased scale and increased expectations of your role. So I find, that the learning treadmill that I'm on is super engaging and exciting, and don't see anything changing with that over the next few years.
No, it sounds like great fun as well as great success.
Most days, yeah.
Now, so just Thank you to everyone who's participating in the chat. Some fantastic observations and insights there. So we really appreciate you keeping it interactive. Don't hesitate to raise any questions if you have them. I do have one further question for Jack that I'd love to hear the answer to. So there's yourself and your own leadership style and how that's changed. What about Clio and its processes, its business processes, or its culture? How has that changed as you
Yeah,
grew?
that's that's a great question. So, I see Cleo's growth journey is basically in two chapters. And one is, the way we operated prior to hitting the Dunbar number, which is around 150 people. So this is the Dunbar number for, I'm sure many of you have heard of it before, but if anyone hasn't, this is basically the number of relationships you can keep in your head. Walk into a room and know somebody by name and maybe remember their kids' names and have some level of familiarity with them. And when your company grows beyond that, you have these awkward moments in the lunchroom where somebody knows you by name and you have no idea who they are. Clio hit that, back in, probably 2012 or 2011 in terms of our employee count. And the key things I discovered, in hitting that number was not only the awkward lunchroom run-ins, but a few things that fell away from or fell apart from a process perspective, or maybe from having a lack of process. One of my favorite sayings is, don't introduce process until you feel the pain of not having it. So I think some companies over-engineer process and put too much process in place too early. But what I saw when we started hitting that Dunbar number was a few things. One is the priorities of the business were not obvious to everyone, and again, when you're a 10 or 50 person startup, everybody just, I think, innately understands what the priorities are and what the business is trying to accomplish. And that fades away as you grow. It's just a bigger company, more layers of communication, and a bit more in the way of, the fog of war, even internally from an organizational perspective. The other thing I saw was one of these lunchroom conversations I had was really surprising to me, where, Ryan and I both met one of these new hires that we hadn't actually interacted with at all. And coming out of a fairly short conversation with this person, we looked at each other, we're like, did we really hire this person? Because they don't feel like a culture fit at all. And sure enough, that person only lasted about a week. And so a few of the things we did to respond to this dynamic was, one, we felt like we had a really special set of values at Clio, but we hadn't actually encapsulated those or codified them in any way. So we went through a very grassroots process, but interviewed our employees. And again, this is when we were just over 100 people, and asked them, what do you think Clio's values are? We've got something special here, but can we, kind of capture that lightning in a bottle and write it down and articulate what it is? And then we came out with our, we refined those and iterated on them, and came out with our 7 values, which if anyone's interested in checking out our values there at culture.clio.com, you can go check out a great little microsite our team put together. And then we operationalized those values as well, where we said, let's put these in our hiring rubric. So part of any interview at Clio is a discussion around our values, and different hiring stakeholders are prodding at different aspects of the values conversation with our employees, and assessing if they're a good fit or not. The other thing we did just around this understanding our goals and priorities is we put a lot of energy into implementing OKRs. And again, I'm sure most people have heard of objectives and key results. We, like distributed by design, implemented these before OKRs were as mainstream as they are today. We've been doing them for probably 11 years, 12 years at Clio now. And it probably took 5 years to get them right, but they're a really powerful system for talking about your top level company priorities and then laddering them down through the organization, and feel like that's been really important in terms of setting the organizational direction with the team. And the last thing we did in response to that Dunbar number experience was, probably until we hit, I would say, 500 employees, either Ryan or myself was the last conversation in every interview, where it was what we call the culture interview. And it was very open-ended, just walking in and spending half an hour with me and Ryan. But we introduced that to make sure that, number one, new employees interacts with one of us, and that builds a bit of a sense of trust and connection, I think, with the founding team. But also as a filter, where again we wanted to make sure we didn't have that lunchtime run-in of, you know, a cocked eyebrow and wondering how on earth we hired that person.
That's fantastic advice, and that resource is really excellent. We've dropped that in the chat, so do check out the Clio microculture site. So one last question for you. I know you're a great advocate for BC and BC Tech and for BC's potential. What do you think is our differentiator? How can BC compete with the world when it comes to building a tech ecosystem and great tech companies?
Well, I think about that from two directions. One is, you know, BC, you know, writ large, and Vancouver in particular, I think is one of the, you know, best places in the world to live and to work. And, you know, especially in today's distributed remote environment, I think it's our right to own that podium. Can we be the best place in the world for knowledge workers and tech workers to work? And can we attract the best companies in the world to headquarter here or have offices here? And can we create a thriving startup ecosystem that is seeing new startups being created all the time? So I think the things we do to make that the case is lean on the advantages we already have, which are, you know, obviously like incredible natural beauty and a great lifestyle that can be accommodated here. Make sure we're producing the talent. So I think we need the universities and the colleges to be producing the kind of talent that tech companies need at scale. We need to be bringing in external talent as much as possible. I think we need to have a thriving immigration system that is bringing talent from around the world to BC as their choice location to live. And we need to make sure that we're keeping the companies we have here and creating, you know, both a tax climate and an overall business climate that lets businesses grow and scale in BC, and encourage as much as we can founders to swing for the fences and not sell early and not get, you know, in some cases acquired by you know, the big US company that ends up shutting down the BC entities. So I think we've got an unreasonable right to win there, and just need to keep working at creating the critical mass, as well as I think the government policies that will let companies thrive in BC.
Fantastic. Thank you. Listen, I don't have questions from the chat, but I do have one final ask of you, which is, this entire conversation has been so valuable, so many different pieces of advice and helpful shared experience. But do you have any parting words to encourage our startups that are on the line today? What would you say to them?
Well, this might seem trite, but I'll say it anyhow. And that's, you know, you need to keep swimming. You're going to be faced with a lot of challenges. And, you know, I think what can be very deceiving about talking about companies like Clio, and even an interview like this, is we mostly talk about the successes and not the darkest times when you're ready to throw in the towel or struggling with, you know, the day to day. And it is always a struggle. And I think as tough as building a startup can be, maintaining that conviction and keeping going when the going gets tough is, I think, what ultimately separates successful startups from those that don't. And if it gives you any comfort, Clio had a lot of existential threats along the way. We had patent troll lawsuits. We, you know, were at one point a week away from not having enough cash in the bank to make payroll. We, you know, we lost key employees during a fundraising process that derailed the fundraise. So, you know, there's a lot that has gone wrong in the background, a lot of challenges and tribulations that have been part of the Clio journey that are the ingredients that I think accumulate to ultimately a success story. But there's a lot of bumps in the road on the way. So when you're having a tough time, figure out a way of keeping your head above water.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Jack.